I live in Vermont. I didn't grow up here, but I spent a lot of time sort of in this area on the New Hampshire-Vermont border growing up, and my father's family is from this area. So, I had very deep roots here. And I've now lived in my small town for 24 years. And my husband grew up, we live in the house my husband grew up in, and we're raising our three kids here. And, as I sort of have gotten involved in the life of our community, I've served on the school board and on the library board. It really became very clear to me how much of the issues we're dealing with and the things we're talking about sort of have their roots in this period in Vermont in the mid 60s, where, within a few years, so many things changed and the state really became, different in a lot of ways. So one of the main ways was that the interstates, Interstate 89 and Interstate 91, which were part of, the Eisenhower federal interstate construction project, were being constructed, and they were, started at the southern borders of the state, and in New Hampshire, in the case of 89, in the late 50s, and so by the early 60s, they were kind of creeping towards our area, and in fact, they cross. So 89 and 91 cross in White River Junction, Vermont, and then go like this. And so it was this sense of how the interstates were going to change life in these small towns along the Connecticut River. And some people were very excited about the opportunities. Some people were very upset about, who would the interstates bring to our areas, and would the kids want to leave now that it would be so easy to drive to Boston and New York, and a lot of this kind of tension and angst about it. And I was fascinated by it, and I did a lot of research, and then started to think about what was happening nationally while these local changes were all happening. And of course, the Vietnam War is ramping up, and the country is just off the Kennedy assassination. The Cold War is making itself felt in so many ways. I mean, people are still at this point in the mid 60s building, nuclear fallout shelters, and there are spies even in Vermont, even in little Vermont, there are spies, in the hills, and it sort of became a place that a lot of spies retired to, or in some cases, had summer houses, and so all of this history just kind of inspired me to write a series set in the mid 60s in this small Vermont town. And Agony Hill begins with Franklin Warren, a Boston cop with a tragic past, arriving in this small town to take a job with the Vermont State Police. And he's barely unpacked his bags when he's called up to a suspicious barn fire, and finds that the farmer has died in the fire, but he has a lot of questions about what happened. Warren, as everyone calls him, begins to look into this suspicious barn fire. He has a lot of questions about the man's family, and the man who died was not very well liked. No, almost nobody has anything good to say about him. So he has some questions about his neighbors and the people who dealt with him and his family members. And he also has some questions about his new next door neighbor, who is Alice Bellows. She's a widow. She's returned to the town where she grew up after the death of her husband. And she's, as she would say, a woman of a certain age. And she kind of helps to run the town in a way. She's on all the boards, and she kind of makes the social life of the town go round. But she also has a past in the intelligence world. Her husband was a CIA officer, and especially during World War II and just after, Alice was sometimes called in to take on jobs that she was uniquely suited to do. And so she's got this history. And for a while, she's assumed that that's in the past. But in Agony Hill, she begins to suspect that her past is not in the past. And in fact, her old handler uh, buys a vacation place in town, and it brings up a lot of old memories and also some old tensions for Alice. They live next door to each other, and Alice is interested right away that this new cop is living next door to her because she's a little bit bored. She had this very exciting life, and she's now kind of, she works in her garden and she goes to her library board meetings, but she's a little bit bored. And so she sees Warren as access to inside information about murders and these cases, right? So she's interested in him for that reason. And he's interested in her because she knows everything about this town. She knows, the time when every single person was born and where and who they're related to and, what happened in their childhood. And that's very valuable to him as the outsider coming in, the new investigator in town. And so they kind of, they have information that the other wants. And that's the initial spark for their friendship. But as they get to know each other, it becomes this sort of unlikely, very deep friendship because they have a lot in common. They enjoy some of the same hobbies. Cooking, they both love to cook, and their friendship sort of develops around those things as they get to know each other. Hunter's Heart Ridge takes place about 3 months after the end of Agony Hill. It's the second season of Vermont's regular deer hunting season, so sort of mid-November. It's getting cold, and Warren has a Sunday off, and he's kind of relaxing when he's called out to a suspicious shooting at a very elite club for powerful men, a hunting and fishing club. And when he gets there, he's told that the victim is actually a former ambassador to West Germany. And so this immediately, there's all kinds of pressure on him to solve this, to not step on anyone's toes. He starts questioning the other men at the club, and he realizes there's someone who is an arms manufacturer who's obviously very involved in the unfolding situation in Vietnam. There's a military man, there are congressmen, powerful lawyers, and there also are some younger men who are the sons of members of the club who are anti-war protesters. And so there's this sort of, generational tension and also just the tension that is, inherent in this murder investigation. And Warren is still pretty new, and he's very worried about this. So he and his deputy, Pinky Goodrich, who's a young Vermont state trooper, show up at the club and start looking into it. And pretty soon, an early season snowstorm blows in and strands them there with no power. The roads are all blocked, and another death occurs, and they realize they're trapped there with a killer, and they need to figure out what happened before someone else is murdered. So it's interesting because Vermont has a lot of hunting camps, so very rustic cabins in the woods that families own and people go to for generations, and it's a very important part of our deer hunting culture is these family camps. We actually don't have a lot of kind of large scale hunting clubs for a whole variety of reasons that would take me a long time to get into, but there are some very sort of elite fishing clubs around the state. And there's just over the border in New Hampshire, there's a place that I was very inspired by to create the book. It's called Corbin Park, and it was built in the I think late 1800s, and it's like an exotic game hunting club basically. And so people will come there, and it's all very secretive, and no one knows exactly, how many buildings are there and who goes there and what animals are there. But people in the surrounding towns got to know about it because there were that some wild boar escaped from this hunting club and began to kind of thrive in the woods around it. And so, farmers were having wild boar come onto their land. And so anyway, so I sort of mashed up a few of these clubs and a little bit of this place, Corbin Park, to create the Ridge Club. So it's a fictional invention, but it is based in reality. There's, one of the fishing clubs near where I live is it's not documented, but supposedly has hosted, every U.S. president between like Teddy Roosevelt and Bill Clinton. And it's just it's there are powerful people sort of who belong to some of these clubs, and I loved that idea of in the woods of Vermont, all of this power and influence.